Listen, the slow, rhythmic washing of ocean waves against a steel hull, and somewhere out in the mist, the deep, mournful echo of a distant foghorn, a sound that seems to hang in the air for a full breath before it fades. It is a sound that asks nothing of you, that only rolls and recedes like the tide itself, and I want you to let it settle somewhere deep in your chest, a low, steady note that already begins to pull the day's weight from your shoulders. And now, welcome back to the quiet hours. Where are you tonight? I sometimes wonder, when I speak these words into the dark, what kind of room is holding you right now. You might be in a bed that has a familiar dip on one side, the sheets soft against your skin, or perhaps you are stretched out on a couch half covered by a wool blanket that smells faintly of old cedar and yesterday's lamp-lit reading. It does not matter, because in this moment we are all in the same deep quiet, scattered across the miles, but tied together by the dark. I have always found that thought strangely comforting, that you and I and all the others who are listening are breathing into this same soft hour like passengers on a ship that needs no destination. Before we go anywhere, I want you to notice exactly where you are right now in your own space. Feel the cool air against your skin, perhaps just on your cheek, a thin ribbon of chill that reminds you that you are safe and warm beneath the covers. The blanket itself is heavy in that comforting way, pressing gently across your shoulders, and if you turn your head a little, you can hear the soft rustle of the fabric, a tiny sound like dried leaves brushing together. The room is dark, and you might notice the faint outline of a window or the distant hum of a city far below, something that tells you the world is still turning, but very, very far away. I want you to take a slow breath now, not because I am telling you to, but because the air is cool and easy, and your body already knows how to settle into the quiet. Feel the rise and fall of your chest, not as an effort, but as a gentle tide that has no hurry at all. The air has a certain density tonight, a damp weight that seems to hold you in place, and if you listen closely, you might even hear the sound of your own breathing blending with the stillness. Somewhere, a heating pipe clicks and settles, or a floorboard sighs, and those small, ordinary sounds are like the punctuation marks in a very long, very slow story. For the next few minutes, there is absolutely nothing you need to do. The weight of the day is already beginning to dissolve, sinking through the mattress, and you can let it go just like that. Now, I want you to imagine that you are not in your room anymore, not quite, but standing on a wooden dock in a harbor at the edge of spring. The air is distinctly colder here, maybe 10 degrees, and it carries a penetrating dampness that you can feel on your cheeks and the back of your hands, a cool, living presence that seems to breathe with the sea. The light from the pier lamps is dim, and amber pooling in golden circles on the wet planks, and beyond the edge of the dock the water is a deep, restless black shimmering softly where the light catches the crests of the smallest ripples. You can smell the salt heavy and clean, and something else, wet ropes and a faint tang of coal smoke that drifts from the funnels of the great ships, a smell that is at once ancient and sharp, like a story woven from 100 vanished crossings. The sound is the most important thing. At first, the slow rhythmic slap of waves against the steel hull, a deep and mournful throb that has no urgency, no need to arrive. A distant foghorn calls out somewhere in the mist, a long, low note that seems to hang in the air for a full breath, and then it fades into the darkness, leaving a hollow silence behind it. You can hear the creak of the dock lines, those thick tarred ropes that groan as the ship shifts against her moorings, and somewhere far away the murmur of hushed voices on the deck, laughing softly, saying goodbyes that are not quite final. There she is. That magnificent ship looming out of the fog like a phantom made of iron and light. Her hull is enormous, a dark cliff of riveted steel, and high above you, the portholes glow like a warm constellation against the gray veil of the afternoon. You can see a faint shimmer of chandelier light through the windows of the first-class dining saloon. And even from here, you think you can hear the delicate clink of silverware, the soft murmur of elegant conversation, a world that is already being carried away from you. This is the RMS Lusitania, and she is a floating palace, a piece of a vanishing world, a marvel of the age. She is preparing to slip into the mist, and already her stack is billowing a slow, cold, heavy breath that mixes with the fog, making the whole scene feel half imagined, half real. If you were to walk up that gangplank now, you would feel the smooth wood of the railing under your palm, cool and polished, and the hull beneath your feet would carry a very slight vibration, the deep, steady thrum of the engines warming up a heartbeat that you could almost believe is the ship's own. I think I want to pause here for a moment because there is a detail that I cannot get out of my mind. Somewhere on this very ship, in one of those first-class cabins, the window is thick glass set in brass, and on the inside of that glass, there is a small, perfect handprint. A child's hand may be pressed there on the last day when the excitement of the voyage was still bright in the air, and the breath of the child fogged the cold pane for just a second before the tiny fingers left their mark in the condensation. It is such a quiet thing, you know, this ghost of a touch that will soon melt away. But for now, it catches the harbor light and gleams like a promise. I find myself returning to that image again and again because it seems to hold everything that was innocent about that spring day in 1915, a day when the world still believed itself to be safe and the sea was still just a vast, beautiful mystery. In the spring of that year, on the 1st of May to be precise, the RMS Lusitania running number 123, slipped her moorings at Pier 54 in New York at 12:20 in the afternoon. She carried some of the wealthiest people in the world, along with ordinary travelers seeking a new life or a brief escape, and they all stood at the rail as the city's skyline shrank and the Statue of Liberty lifted her torch in the fading light. The passengers, wrapped in their traveling coats, watched that torch recede until it was no more than a smudge of green against the gray, a candle guttering in a vast room. And then they turned back to the warmth inside, to the clatter of plates and the murmur of social life. They were sailing straight into a war zone, straight into the path of a new kind of violence that no amount of wealth or civility could hold back. And yet, on that afternoon, the only thing they truly carried was the belief that civilized nations did not sink civilian ships. It was a belief as fragile and as real as the handprint on the glass. Let the tension of your day melt into that cold, damp air now. Let it drift from your shoulders and sink into the dark water below the hull, because there is no hurry at all. Tonight, we journey back to the cold waters of the Celtic Sea, and we will witness from a great distance, and with the gentlest of hands, how a single invisible weapon destroyed not just a ship, but the last illusions of a gentleman's war. But not yet. For now, there is only the fog and the foghorn's note that stretches out and fades, stretches out and fades, as if the sea itself is breathing and the ship glides forward like a dream that has not yet reached its ending. I want you to see it from some high, invisible vantage point just above the water as the afternoon deepens and the land falls away behind her. The ship's silhouette is soft and gray, almost absorbed by the mist, and her three great funnels lean back just slightly as if she is already straining toward a horizon she cannot yet see. From this distance, she seems very small and very quiet, a toy boat floating in a basin of silver, moving with a patience that belongs to another century. The surface of the sea is not calm in a static way, but it moves with a slow, swelling rhythm like the chest of a sleeping giant, and the reflection of the ship shimmers and breaks on the dark water, a path of trembling gold that stretches out and vanishes into the gray. You can feel the cool, damp air on your skin, the way it turns your breath into little clouds, and you can hear the engines beneath the waterline, a deep, monotonous thrum that you sense more than hear a sound that seems to be the ship's own slow breathing. Inside that ship, tucked away in a small cabin near the after funnel, there is a room that hums with a different kind of life. It is the wireless room, a space no larger than a closet, filled with crackling static and the sharp scent of ozone that gathers around the spark apparatus. On a quiet afternoon, a young operator whose name might have been McCormick, or perhaps it was another name, I am not quite sure. He sits with his fingers resting lightly on the brass key, and he listens to the scratch of distant signals coming through the headphones. The dots and dashes are a kind of music, a rhythm that carries weather reports and the polite inquiries about arrival times, the ordinary language of the sea. There is no urgency in his movements yet. He might be thinking about his dinner or about the letter he meant to post before they left New York. But in that small room, the air is full of something that feels almost sacred to me now. The invisible web of communication that was just beginning to lace the world together, a thread of light in the gray that would one day become a lifeline. You know, I have always been drawn to the quiet before something immense, that suspended breath when everything is still normal. And that afternoon, as the Lusitania steamed eastward, the wireless spoke in its soft staccato whisper, and no one on board thought much about it. It was simply the way the great ship stayed in touch, a convenience for the rich and a comfort for the crew. But what those operators did not know, what no one could have guessed, was that every dot and dash they exchanged was quietly laying the foundation for a revolution in safety at sea. The unsung hero of this story, the one piece that would remain standing long after the hull slipped beneath the waves, was that small brass key and the invisible signals it sent out. Signals that would in time change everything. I will not give you that part yet, but I want you to hold the idea like a small, warm stone in your palm and let it settle there. For now, let the sound of the foghorn return. Let it rise and fall in your mind, that deep, vibrating note that seems to pull you deeper into the dark. As it echoes, the ship's silhouette becomes even softer, and the mist wraps around her funnels like a shroud. But there is no fear in it, I promise. It is simply the way of the sea, the slow dance of the elements. The water beneath the hull is black and glossy, and the reflection of the ship's lights trembles on its surface like a half-forgotten memory. You might notice far off a faint glow on the horizon, perhaps the last light of a sunset that you cannot quite see, or the first glimmer of a distant coastal town. But it is too distant to matter. All that exists is the here and now, the quiet monotone of the engines, the creak of the rigging, the damp kiss of the fog on your cheek. If you let yourself drift a little more, you might find yourself walking along the promenade deck very slowly, with one hand trailing on the cold, smooth iron of the rail. The wind has a raw edge here that carries the scent of the open Atlantic, not the harbor, but the deep sea, cold and ancient and impossibly deep. Your fingers feel the vibration of the engines through the metal, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that seems to echo the pulse in your own wrist, and the deck beneath your feet rises and falls with the long, easy swell. Somewhere above you, the wireless antenna hums almost imperceptibly, and if you listen very carefully, you can imagine the invisible pulses of energy radiating outward, the dots and dashes that the young operator is tapping out below the funnel. He might be sending something as ordinary as all well weather clear, and that message is bouncing across the waves, touching a shore station far away, and being written down by another operator who dips his pen in ink and smiles at the word well. I used to think about that word well. It seemed so small, but in the middle of a world that was unraveling, it must have felt like a tiny anchor. The people who sent it were casually reassuring one another, and I suppose that is what we all do in our own ways. We send out little signals into the dark, hoping someone will hear and send something back. And on that evening, the fog was so thick that the ship's whistle moaned at intervals, a sound that was not a warning, but almost a comfort, a reminder that the giant was alive and moving. The passengers in the lounges below probably paused in their conversations and tilted their heads for a moment listening, and then returned to their cards or their cups of tea. There is something deeply peaceful about being inside a warm room when the world outside is cold and blind. Now let me bring you back to that porthole, the one with the child's handprint. It is on the starboard side, maybe 10 feet above the waterline, and if you look through it now, you would see only the churning darkness and the occasional fleck of spray that darts up from the waves. The glass is cold, and the little handprint is still there, though the condensation is slowly creeping back, blurring the edges until the fingers look like soft, fading petals. It might belong to a girl named Emily, or perhaps a boy called John. I do not know. But I like to think that they pressed their palm there just before being told to come away from the glass, and that for a moment the sea seemed very close and very immense and very beautiful. That image, so fragile, holds all the tenderness of that voyage, the innocence of the last afternoon, when nothing was yet broken. I want to linger in this moment a little longer, because tonight we are not in a hurry. The story I am going to share with you is not about the noise or the chaos, but about the silence that came before and the quiet revolution that followed. You see the wireless messages that passed through that radio room in the ship's last hours? They would someday be gathered up and read, their dots and dashes transformed into a record that would rewrite how we keep each other safe at sea. It became a network of voices that never sleep, a net that stretches across the dark water, even now, holding every ship in a quiet embrace. But that is still ahead, and like a page not yet turned. For now, I just want you to feel the weightlessness of floating in the fog, the gentle sway of the deck that rocks you like a cradle. Let your body sink deeper into the bed, and let the cold sea air in your imagination become the cool pillow beneath your head. Everything is soft and slow and muffled. You might be imagining the passengers on the boat deck wrapped in their traveling coats, their breath making small white puffs in the air. Somewhere, a deck steward is extinguishing a lantern, and the glass chimney ticks softly as it cools. A woman in a gray silk gown is turning away from the window, adjusting the pearls at her throat, and she is thinking about the garden parties she will attend in London, parties that will never happen. But she does not know that yet, and so the thought is still a happy one. Up on the deck, a young man in a cloth cap leans against the rail watching the water curl away from the bow, and he feels the slight chill on his face and tucks his hands deeper into his pockets. He does not know what is ahead, of course, and that is the mercy of the moment. The world is still ancient and safe, held together by the belief that civilized nations do not sink civilian ships, and the engines beat on steady as a heart. The whole scene is like a painting by an artist who loved the gray half-tones of twilight, the way light and water blend until you cannot tell where the sea ends and the sky begins. And through it all, that steady, primordial beat of the foghorn, a sound that has echoed across these waters for centuries, before any wireless existed, a sound that is older than language, older than memory. It is joined now by the soft, rhythmic clicking of the telegraph key, a modern heartbeat that will one day outlast the ship itself. I think that is what draws me back to the Lusitania again and again, not the drama of the tragedy, but the quiet, unsung heroes who sat in that small room tapping out messages that would become the first strand in a safety net that still holds us. Now, as you drift a little further, I want you to see very far away the fading torch of the Statue of Liberty, the way the passengers saw it from the stern railing as the ship pulled out of New York. She is no more than a smudge of green against the gray, but that tiny flame seems to burn on its own, a last beacon. For the people who gathered to watch that sight must have felt monumental and yet also terribly small, like a candle guttering in a vast room. They watched it until it was swallowed by the fog, and then they turned back to the warmth of the ship's interior, to the clatter of plates and the murmur of social life. I have always thought that this moment, the vanishing of that torch, was a kind of quiet turning point. It was the moment when the old world slipped away and the new one, the one of invisible dangers and invisible safeguards, began to take shape. But none of them knew that. They just felt the cold and the surge of the ship and the promise of dinner in an hour. So let that thought settle with you like the settling of the ship deeper into the water as her bunkers fill with coal. The journey tonight is a slow one, and I promise we will not reach any destination too soon. The Celtic Sea is ahead, cold and gray, and somewhere beneath those waters, a single invisible weapon will change everything. Not just a ship, but the last illusions of a gentleman's war. But I will not show you that part yet. Right now, there is only the fog and the foghorn and the handprint on the glass and the gentle tapping of the wireless key that seems to whisper, "All well, all well." I think I will leave you with that sound, the soft, rhythmic clicking that becomes the heartbeat of the night. Let it blend with the sound of your own breathing, the slow, steady rise and fall. The fog is thickening outside the ship's windows now, and the world is becoming formless and quiet. If you were to stand on that deck, you would not be able to see your own hand in front of your face, but you would feel the moisture on your skin and the solid, reassuring bulk of the iron bulkhead behind you, and the deep hum of the engines carrying you forward into a world that is not yet written. The wireless antenna trembles one last time in the wind, sending a final gentle pulse into the dark, a message that says nothing more than "I am here." And then the mist closes over everything, and the sound of the waves becomes the only thing you hear, a lullaby as old as the sea. That is where I will leave you for now, suspended in the mist, with the promise that the rest of the story will drift toward you when you are ready. Sleep if you can, and let the fog hold you. I will sit here a little longer, and if you want me to continue, you know what to do. Good night. The mist is still with you, I think, as you begin to settle a little deeper into wherever you are right now. I want you to know that you are safe here, perfectly safe, just listening to the sound of my voice. It drifts toward you like something carried on a slow current. The fog from the last chapter is lifting now, not all at once, but in gentle ribbons that pull apart to reveal something vast and gray and shimmering. And there, cutting through the Atlantic swell with a grace that seems almost impossible for something so immense, is a ship. You see her first from a great distance, a dark silhouette against the pale morning horizon. Even from here, you can sense her speed, the way she seems to be not so much sailing as gliding, her four great funnels raked back at a proud, elegant angle. This is the RMS Lusitania, and for a moment, just a moment, she is the most beautiful thing ever built by human hands. Feel the cool, crisp air on your face now, the salt of the open ocean sharp and clean as you drift closer to her. The sound that reaches you first is not the crash of waves against the hull, but something deeper, a steady, powerful thrum that vibrates through the water itself. It seems to resonate somewhere in your chest. I always thought that sound was like a heartbeat, you know, a great iron heart beating somewhere deep in the belly of the ship. It is a sound that promises power, promises safety, promises that nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. You can almost feel it through the soles of your shoes if you imagine yourself standing on her deck. That constant rhythmic pulse travels up through the polished wood and the steel beams and settles into your bones. It is so steady, so reassuring, that after a while, you stop noticing it at all. It becomes part of the background of your existence aboard this floating palace, as natural as breathing. And perhaps that is the most dangerous thing about it, though no one aboard knows that yet. Let yourself drift now not on the water, but in the air above her. Look down at the long, sleek shape of her hull, cutting through the gray-green sea like a knife through silk. She was known as the Greyhound of the Seas, and you can see why, even from this height. Her lines seemed to flow from bow to stern without a single interruption. Every curve and angle was designed for one purpose: speed, glorious, breathtaking speed. Before the Titanic claimed the world's imagination with her tragedy, the Lusitania was the undisputed queen of the transatlantic crossing. She was the ship that everyone dreamed of sailing on, the marvel of an age that believed it had conquered the elements. Her hull was painted a deep, glossy black that gleamed wetly in the ocean spray. Above that rose the white superstructure, tier upon tier of decks and windows and railings that climbed toward the sky like a city made of dreams and riveted steel. And the funnels, those 4 magnificent funnels, were painted in the Cunard red, a deep, warm orange red that stood out against the gray sky and the darker gray sea. From their tops trailed thin ribbons of smoke that the wind caught and scattered into nothing. Come a little lower now through the smoke and the salt mist, and let yourself slip through one of the great domed skylights that crown the first-class dining saloon. What you find there is a world of such opulence that it takes your breath away. The light pours down through the stained glass dome, that dome rising high overhead in a great arch of glass and iron. The colors that fall onto the white linen tablecloths below are like something from a painting: soft blues and deep golds and pale rose pinks that shift and dance as the ship moves gently on the swell. You see the tables set with gleaming china, the silverware catching the light in little flashes of brilliance, the crystal glasses waiting to be filled with wine. Fresh flowers, always fresh flowers, are arranged in the center of each table. Their scent mixes with the faint aroma of polished wood and the salt air that somehow found its way in through an open porthole somewhere. The chairs are upholstered in rich velvet, deep burgundy, and forest green. The carpet beneath your feet is so thick that your footsteps make no sound at all. Everything is hushed and warm and impossibly luxurious. The murmur of conversation rises like a gentle tide around you, soft voices speaking in English and French and German. The clink of fine china punctuates the quiet hum of civilized discourse. Somewhere in the corner, a string quartet is playing something by Debussy, the notes floating up toward the stained glass dome like pale butterflies. You can walk now, if you like, through the dining saloon and into the smoking lounge beyond. There, the light is dimmer and the air is rich with the scent of leather and cigar smoke. The mahogany panels on the walls glow with a deep, dark warmth that seems to come from within the wood itself. The leather chairs are deep, and comfortable, worn just enough to be welcoming. Beside them, small tables hold crystal ashtrays and silver bells that can summon a steward with a silent gesture. It is all so solid, so permanent, so utterly certain of its own existence. This little world of mahogany and brass and cut glass floats above the cold, deep waters of the North Atlantic. Slide through the lounge now and out onto the promenade deck. The temperature drops instantly, and the crisp ocean breeze touches your skin like a cool hand. You can feel the polished wood of the railing beneath your fingers, smooth and cool and slightly damp from the spray. Lean there for a long, slow moment and watch the waves roll past below, endless gray-green hills of water that stretch to the horizon in every direction. I have always found something deeply peaceful about the open sea, the way it seems to exist outside of time, outside of all the petty concerns that fill our days on land. Out here on the promenade deck of the Lusitania, that feeling is even stronger because the ship beneath you is so steady, so unshakable, that you almost forget you're on the water at all. But then you notice the slow, gentle rise and fall of the deck as the ship encounters a larger swell. It is a movement so subtle that it is more like a breath than a motion. And you remember that beneath your feet there is nothing but miles of cold, dark water. Let yourself wander now past the rows of deck chairs with their blankets tucked neatly over the armrests. Walk past the couples strolling arm in arm in their fine wool coats, and past the children who are supposed to be with their nannies, but have somehow escaped to watch the ocean slide by. Let yourself feel the strange, suspended quality of this world. Everyone aboard this ship is in motion, crossing from one continent to another, from the old world to the new, or perhaps the other way around. Yet, for these few days, they exist in a kind of enchanted pause, a floating pocket of time where the normal rules do not apply. They eat elaborate meals, they dance in the ballroom, they read novels in the library with its shelves of leather-bound books and its great globe that spins slowly on its axis. All the while the ship carries them forward at a speed that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. And that speed, that miracle of modern engineering that made the Lusitania the fastest ship on the Atlantic, was born of something hidden far below the grand saloons and the elegant promenades. Something the passengers never saw and rarely thought about. If you could slip through the decks like a ghost passing through the layers of luxury and into the working heart of the ship, you would find yourself in a world of fire and steam and relentless motion. There in the boiler rooms, men shoveled coal into furnaces that glowed with an orange heat so intense it seemed to have a life of its own. Her quadruple expansion steam turbines produced 76,000 horsepower, driving her at more than 25 knots across the gray Atlantic. That was faster than any submarine of her day, faster than any threat that lurked beneath the waves. That is what they believed, the designers and the engineers and the proud owners of the Cunard line. They believed their Greyhound could simply outrun any danger that the world might throw at her. And perhaps in a way there is a quiet insight to be found there, floating above this magnificent ship as she cuts through the sea with such effortless grace. Speed was her armor, but it was also her Achilles' heel. In sacrificing compartmentalization for velocity, she was already wounded before she ever left port. The boilers and the coal bunkers, the great roaring heart of her, were not buried safely in the center of the hull. They were not protected by layers of empty space and watertight doors. Instead, they were positioned along the sides of the ship, running in long, vulnerable corridors just behind the thin skin of steel that separated the warmth within from the cold, waiting sea. It was a compromise made in the name of speed, a design that allowed the engines to breathe and the turbines to spin and the ship to fly across the waves. But it meant that any impact along her flank would strike directly at the source of her power, the great furnaces and the mountains of coal that fed them. This was not a secret, exactly the way the Lusitania was built. But it was not something that the passengers in their velvet chairs and their silk gowns ever considered. And why would they, after all, when the string quartet was playing and the champagne was cold and the horizon stretched ahead of them, clear and unbroken? There was another secret, though, one whispered only in the corridors of power and the offices of the Admiralty. A secret that had been built into the ship from the very beginning. The British government in those years before the war that was already raging across Europe had provided a substantial subsidy for the construction of the Lusitania. In return, the ship had been designed with certain modifications, certain hidden compartments, certain spaces in her hull that were meant to carry cargo of a very particular kind during wartime. Munitions, artillery shells, the tools of destruction hidden away beneath the fine dining rooms and the mahogany-paneled lounges. A secret cargo that the passengers never knew about, that the crew never spoke of, that rested in the darkness of the hold like a sleeping dragon. And yet, up here in the light of the stained glass dome, with the morning sun streaming down and the string quartet playing and the ocean stretching away to infinity on every side, none of that seems real at all. None of it seems possible. You can let your gaze drift slowly across the faces of the passengers gathered in the dining saloon. The wealthy industrialists and their wives, the young couples on their honeymoon, the children in their stiff collars and starched dresses, the elderly gentlemen with their newspapers and their cups of tea. Not one of them knows that beneath their feet, in the hidden places of the ship they trust so completely, there are things that were never meant to be spoken of. Their faces are peaceful, untroubled, lit by the shifting colors of the stained glass above them. You can see the way the light touches the curve of a cheek, the silver of a woman's hair, the small hands of a child reaching for a piece of bread. It is all so ordinary, so perfectly heartbreakingly ordinary. The vibration of the engines continues its steady, reassuring pulse, that deep thrum that you can feel through the soles of your shoes if you stand very still and pay attention. It is the heartbeat of the ship, the promise that everything is working exactly as it should. The great turbines are spinning, and the propellers are turning, and the shore is drawing closer with every passing hour. There is a comfort in that vibration, a kind of mechanical lullaby that seems to say, "Sleep, rest, you are safe here. I will carry you across the sea, and nothing will harm you." The passengers listen to that promise with their bones, if not with their ears, and they believe it. How could they not, surrounded as they are by so much beauty, so much wealth, so much evidence of human mastery over the elements? I want you to stay here for a while longer, watching the light move across the stained glass dome as the ship rises and falls on the gentle swell. The colors shift and blend and separate again, blue into gold, into rose, and back to blue. There is no hurry, you know. No need to move forward into the chapters that wait ahead. No need to think about what lies beneath the waves or what secrets the wireless telegraph will send crackling through the air in the hours to come. Right now, there is only this moment, this long, slow, suspended moment. The ship glides through the gray Atlantic. The string quartet plays its soft music. The fresh flowers bloom on the white linen tablecloths. The polished railings are cool beneath your hands, and the salt air is clean and sharp in your lungs. Let the heartbeat of the engines become your own heartbeat, for a while steady and slow and untroubled. Let the world above the dome, the world of fog and cold and invisible dangers, fade away into the distance where it belongs. The Atlantic stretches on forever around you, gray-green waves marching toward the horizon in endless procession. The sky above is pale and soft, a sky that could be morning or evening or any time in between. Out here, time has no meaning. Out here, there is only the ship and the sea and the slow, steady rhythm of the engines carrying everyone forward into a future that has not yet been written. If you listen very carefully, you can hear the clink of china from the dining saloon, the murmur of conversation from the smoking lounge, the distant laughter of a child running along the promenade deck. And beneath it all, always beneath it all, the deep, powerful thrum that is the voice of the ship herself. The greyhound of the seas speaks in a language older than words, older than music, older than anything the passengers in their elegant clothes could ever understand. Let yourself drift now a little further away perhaps, back into the quiet space where you are listening to my voice. Let the image of the ship remain behind you, suspended in its moment of perfect peace. Its domes and funnels and railings glow faintly in the pale Atlantic light. The story will wait for you just as the sea waits patient and eternal. When you are ready to return, the Lusitania will still be there, still cutting through the waves, still carrying its secrets beneath the waterline. It will still be thrumming with that deep, steady heartbeat that promises safety and speed and the triumph of human ingenuity over the cold, indifferent ocean. But for now, just let the colors of the stained glass fade in your mind. Let the distant music dissolve into silence and let the sound of the waves take its place. That sound is as old as the earth itself, a lullaby that has been singing since long before there were ships or engines or wireless telegraphs. A lullaby that will still be singing long after all of it is gone. You stand at the edge of the vast wooden pier, and the morning light is thin and gray over the Hudson River. The air has that particular bite of early May in this city, a chill that lingers around 12 degrees, just enough to make you tighten your coat around your shoulders. The wool is coarse beneath your fingers, and the breath of 1,000 other passengers hangs in little clouds before dissolving into the salt-scented breeze. You feel the rough grain of the planks through the soles of your shoes, the vibrations of footsteps and moving crates trembling up from the ancient timbers. Seagulls wheel overhead, their cries mixing with the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones somewhere behind you. And the sharper sounds of stevedores calling to one another in a language that is half shouting and half song. It is May 1st, the year is 1915. And the whole world seems to have gathered here at Pier 54 to witness the departure of the greatest ship on the Atlantic. You move slowly through the crowd, and the scene unfolds like a painting in a museum, every detail suspended in its own quiet light. There is a man in a heavy tweed overcoat lifting his daughter onto his shoulders, so she can see the gleaming white hull rising like a cliff above the pier. Her laughter rings out bright and pure, and for a moment it cuts through everything else. A vendor pushes a cart laden with tin cups and a steaming urn. And the smell of coffee drifts toward you, dark and bitter, mingling with the sharper tang of horse manure that still clings to the stones from the carriage rank. You pass a stand stacked with newspapers, their pages fluttering in the breeze. And the inky smell of fresh newsprint reaches you, a smell that somehow promises the whole world reduced to black columns of type that you can hold in your hands. The bustle is immense, and yet there is a strange underwater quality to it all. As if the excitement itself has been muffled by the weight of the ocean that waits just beyond the slip. Now look more closely at that newspaper stand because something there is drawing the attention of a few passengers. A small knot of people who have paused in the river of travelers. The man behind the counter has tacked up a placard that shows the Cunard sailing schedule, the proud letters announcing the Lusitania's departure at 10 in the morning. But directly beside it, so close that the two notices almost touch, is another printed sheet with a thick black border. Stark as a mourning card. The words are set in heavy type. And even from a few steps away, you notice the way the black frame seems to press against the cheerful advertisements all around. As if the page itself has drawn a deep, solemn breath. The Imperial German Embassy warns that vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in the waters adjacent to the British Isles. And that travelers sailing in the war zone on such ships do so at their own risk. There is no shouting in the text, no exclamation point, just that quiet black border that frames the message like a funeral announcement. And the letters sit there with a patience that is somehow more unsettling than any threat spoken aloud. Let your gaze settle on the newspaper as a hand reaches out to touch the page. The fingers are gloved in pale kid leather, and you notice that they hesitate just barely as they trace the edge of that black rectangle. The woman to whom the hand belongs is perhaps 30, with a face that has known both laughter and worry. And she reads the warning once then again, while the crowd eddies around her like water around a stone. Her lips part slightly, and for the space of a breath, it seems she might speak or cry out or turn back toward the city. But then her fingers slide to the corner of the paper, and with a soft rustle, she turns the page, and the sailing schedule disappears beneath a column about the stock market, and the moment passes as if it had never been. The crowd closes in again, and the woman moves forward, her expression now as smooth as the river surface beyond the pier. You follow her progress toward the gangway, and you feel the coarse wool of her coat sleeve brush past your arm. There is a heaviness in the air now that was not there before. A kind of shadow that the bright white paint of the Lusitania's hull cannot quite dispel. And yet, the overall impression is still one of gaiety and splendor, of 1,000 hopes packed into steamer trunks. Of champagne waiting in the first-class saloon, and engines already building up their deep, resonant thrum deep in the ship's belly. The captain himself, a man whose name is spoken with reverence, has assured everyone that the Lusitania can outrun any submarine on Earth. This is a known fact, repeated so often that it has become a kind of lullaby. And besides, there is the greater truth that no one says aloud but everyone feels. The Royal Navy rules the waves and has always ruled them. And somehow that makes the black-bordered warning seem like the theatrical gesture of a distant empire that does not know its place. You pause at the foot of the gangway and look up at the towering side of the ship, where rivets the size of dinner plates march in endless lines. The metal is cold. When you reach out to touch it, colder than the air, colder than you expected. And for a moment, the sensation anchors you here. A porter jostles past with a trunk on his shoulder, and the smell of leather and old travel rises from the luggage that is being carried aboard in a great stream. You can hear snatches of conversation from the people around you, a scattering of accents from a dozen countries, all of them woven together into a murmur that sounds almost like the sea itself. There is peace in that sound. You think a peace that no printed warning can disturb. Or perhaps it is not peace at all, but something more fragile, a collective decision to ignore the one dark thread in the bright tapestry of the day. The psychology of denial is a quiet thing, and it does not announce itself with trumpets. It settles instead into the small cracks between what is known and what is believed. You can see it in the way a man straightens his tie and laughs a little too loudly at a joke, as if laughter could chase away the faint chill that has nothing to do with the spring weather. You can see it in the way a mother adjusts her child's collar and says something about the adventure they're going to have, without once letting her eyes rest on the newspaper stand, now lost in the crowd. The Victorian world, after all, had its own grammar of certainty, a conviction that civilization had erected walls against barbarism, that there were rules of war, and that even the newest weapons would obey them. It is so easy now, looking back from your quiet vantage point, to wonder how they could have trusted so completely. But trust is a warm blanket, and the cold was still a long way off. There is a woman standing just beside the gangway, and she has paused to look back at the shore. Her hand goes to her throat, and her fingers find a small locket on a chain, the metal warm from her skin. She touches it with the gentleness of a prayer, and her eyes search the faces of the crowd on the pier as if looking for someone who might not be there. You watch her for what feels like a long time, for seconds that stretch into minutes in the unhurried rhythm of this morning. She is wearing a coat of dark blue serge, and the wind off the river lifts a strand of hair that has escaped from beneath her hat. The boisterous passengers streaming aboard push past her without seeing the hesitation that holds her in place. And the noise of the stevedoras seems to recede just a little, as if the world itself were giving her this moment of stillness. Her eyes glisten, and you notice the tear-streaked shine on her cheeks catching the pale light. Perhaps she has been crying, though there is no way to know. Then she blinks, and the ghost of the newspaper's black border passes across her face like a cloud shadow on water, and she turns once more toward the ship. The crowd swallows her the way the sea swallows a stone, and she climbs the cold metal ladder without looking back again. The captain's assurance, the belief in speed, the faith in naval supremacy, these things were not foolishness, not exactly. You can hold them in your mind like smooth stones from a riverbed, each one worn down by generations of habit and pride. The Lusitania herself had crossed the Atlantic again and again, threading through storms and fog. And she had always arrived on time, her flag snapping, her great engines never faltering. To the passengers, she was not merely a ship, but a floating argument against the impossible, a rebuttal to the darkness that lurked beneath the waves. And so, when the morning of the 1st of May broke gray and brisk, and the warning appeared in plain type alongside the sailing schedule, the mind did what minds do when faced with something that does not fit. It smoothed the edges. It found a comfortable story. It turned the page. There was a pause, just a second, when the warning was read, a moment of stillness in which a decision settled into place, and then the ship sailed. You might imagine now the way the great vessel slowly drew away from the pier. The tugs fussing around her like water beetles, the hawsers splashing into the river and being hauled aboard, dripping. The crowd on shore waved handkerchiefs and hats, a sea of fluttering white that mimicked the wings of the gulls above. On the promenade deck, passengers leaned over the railings calling out last words that the wind snatched away and scattered. The band was playing, though you cannot quite hear it from here. A lively tune meant to chase away the lingering unease that the morning's newspaper had planted in a few hearts. And maybe some of them did feel it, that tiny seed of doubt buried so deep that it would not sprout for another 6 days. But for now, there was only the exhilaration of departure, the city shrinking behind them. The open water ahead and the steady pulse of the engines that promised speed, speed, speed. The cold metal of the gangway ladder had left a faint smell on your hands. A sharp, metallic scent that mingles now with the salt and the distant coffee. Your own coat is a comfortable weight on your shoulders, and you feel the rough weave of it. The way the fibers catch slightly on your fingers when you brush them across the sleeve. The day is still chilly enough that you can see your breath, but the sun is beginning to win its battle with the clouds. And a pale wash of gold spreads across the river like a slow, quiet thought. You walk along the pier, stepping around coils of rope and stacks of wooden crates. And you notice that the newspaper vendor is now folding his stand, the morning sales complete. He tucks the last of the placards under his arm, the black-bordered warning among them. And his face is blank as if he has seen too many departures to remember this one. Soon the pier will be empty, except for the gulls and the smell of fish and the lapping of the river against the pilings. Now, let your attention drift upward higher than the pier. Higher even than the tallest mast of the ship that is now a white speck downriver. You are looking at the whole city from a great and gentle distance, as if you were suspended in the gray sky above the spires and smokestacks of New York. From here, the crowd is an organic pattern, a slow tide of humanity that has washed up to the edge of the water and is now receding. The ship is a tiny fleck of white on the widening river, moving toward the Narrows and the open sea beyond. It is a peaceful image, almost a painting, in gray and silver. And there is no hint of the darkness that would in time attach itself to that hull. The Atlantic waits cold and patient. But for now, the only sound is the long, low moan of a foghorn somewhere out in the bay. A note that seems to hang in the air like a question no one needs to answer. And perhaps, as you drift there in that high, quiet place, you think about the messages that will soon crackle through the wireless. The arcs of invisible electricity that will leap from the ship's towering masts to stations on distant shores. The passengers do not know it yet, but their journey is already being written in dots and dashes, a conversation that will grow more urgent with each passing day. I have always found a strange comfort in that. The thought that even before the ship leaves the harbor, a thread of communication is stretching ahead of her. Invisible and patient, waiting to carry voices across the water. You know, it is the wireless that will become the true narrator of this story, the quiet hero that no one on the pier can see or touch or even imagine. But for now, it simply hums beneath the hours like a second heartbeat. You might find yourself returning to that woman with the locket, the one who paused at the gangway and looked back. Who was she, and what did she see in that last glance at the shore? Perhaps she was thinking of someone she had left behind, a face at a window, or a voice she would never hear again. Or perhaps she had read the warning in the newspaper, really read it, and the words had settled in her stomach like a cold stone. But then she had looked at the ship, at the great funnels and the polished wood and the confident smiles of the officers. And she had decided that the risk was a ghost, a thing made of paper and ink. Something that could not possibly touch the solid steel of the Lusitania. It is a familiar trick that the human mind plays on itself, this choosing of comfort over caution. And you can feel a kind of tenderness for it now looking back from the safety of your own quiet evening. The ship is beyond the harbor now, and the tugs have turned back their work done. The pilot has climbed down into the little boat that will carry him home. And the captain has taken full command, his hands resting lightly on the rail of the bridge. The passengers are exploring the wonders of the floating palace, finding their cabins, marveling at the stained glass in the first-class lounge. Their voices mingle with the clink of teacups and the distant strains of the orchestra tuning up for the afternoon concert. And beneath it all, constant as a heartbeat, the engines thrum, pushing the ship onward at a speed that feels like safety itself. The sea is vast and gray and empty, and it holds more secrets than any of them can imagine. But for this moment, just for this one unfolding moment, everything is still exactly as it should be. There was a pause, just a second, when the warning was read, a moment of stillness in which a decision settled into place, and then the ship sailed. I think about that pause now, and about all the small moments that live inside it, the half-formed thoughts and the swallowed fears. And the very human conviction that the worst things happen to other people in other places at other times. You are lying somewhere safe as you listen to this, wrapped in the soft weight of your own blankets. And the morning at Pier 54 is 100 years and an ocean away. The chill of that spring breeze cannot reach you. The smell of newsprint and horse manure has long since faded from the air. And yet, if you close your eyes, you might still see the black-bordered warning stark and terrible in the gray light. And the hand that hesitated, and the page that turned. The foghorn sounds again far away, and its echo rolls across the water like a memory that cannot quite take shape. I remember thinking, "They wouldn't dare," wrote one survivor decades later. Her handwriting trembling a little from age, the letters shaped by hands that had grown knotted with time. She was an old woman by then, and the ship was just a photograph in a drawer that she could barely bring herself to look at. But that moment on the pier, the crisp air, the smell of the river, the black rectangle on the news page had stayed with her all her life. She had been one of the ones who laughed at the warning, who tucked it away as the dramatic posturing of a faraway enemy who did not understand the power of British steel. Actually, I think she carried that laugh all the way across the Atlantic until the day it died in her throat 6 days later off the coast of Ireland. But we do not need to follow her that far, not yet. Let the ship stay suspended for a while longer in the pale sunshine of its first afternoon at sea. Let the saloon stewards polish the silver, and let the children chase each other around the decks. And let the wireless operator tap out the cheerful messages that passengers pay extra to send. There is time enough for the story to turn darker, and there will be a chapter for that. But this chapter is about the threshold, the moment when every journey is still a promise. And the shadow is only a small dark shape on a newspaper page that the wind might carry away. So I will stay here a little longer, watching the pier grow empty under the gray sky, listening to the gulls and the water and the last echoes of a crowd that has already dissolved into the city. You are still here with me, and I am glad of it. The wool of your coat has softened with the warmth of your body, and your fingers have grown accustomed to the weight of the memory you are holding. The memory of a woman touching her locket and looking back. The ship is gone, now vanished beyond the horizon, and the river flows placidly past the wooden pilings where the stevedores have stacked the last of the empty crates. The coffee vendor has wheeled his cart away, and the newspaper stand is just a bare wooden frame stripped of its lies and its warnings alike. Soon the afternoon will deepen and the temperature will drop a few more degrees. And the fog will roll in from the sea, soft and gray and full of quiet. That fog will wrap around the city like a blanket, the same fog that the Lusitania will meet somewhere out on the open ocean. And in it, for a little while, the boundaries between then and now, between the living and the remembered, will blur into something that feels almost like sleep. The sound shifts here so gradually you might not notice at first. The quiet hush of fog over the river and the sleeping city melts into something deeper, a steady and mechanical breath. It is the hum of electric motors, a low, constant note that travels through the steel hull and fills the small space like a lullaby. And the air is thick and still, carrying a mix of diesel oil, old wool, and a faint, salty tang that has seeped in somewhere and decided to stay. The light does not come from the gray sky above, but from a single bare bulb that swings gently on a short cord. And it casts a soft, warm circle that moves like a slow lantern across the curved metal walls. There is no open deck here now, just this snug steel room beneath the surface of the Atlantic. A place that feels almost like a hidden room in a very old house, sealed and safe. Let your imagination drift down into this quiet chamber where the only warmth comes from the bodies of men resting in their wool uniforms. A gentle, shared heat in a space that holds them like cupped hands. I want you to take a slow breath with me, as slow as you can, and settle into the rhythm of this underwater world. There is no hurry here, only the constant hum and the gentle roll of the submerged vessel and the sound of droplets falling somewhere in the dark. A steady, soothing tap. The men speak in murmurs when they speak at all, because sound carries strangely in this metal cocoon. and they have learned to let their voices become part of the machinery. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, stands near the periscope well, with his hand resting lightly on one of the cold brass handles. And his face in the dim light is calm and unreadable. He is not much older than the young sailors who look to him for guidance. But there is a stillness in him that comes from long hours of watching and waiting in a world without sun or stars. His wool coat is damp at the shoulders, and a faint sheen of moisture covers everything. The dials and the pipes and the small valves that the engineers check with quiet, practiced fingers. The temperature inside the hull hovers somewhere around 8 degrees, a coolness that settles into the joints. And yet, no one complains, because the chill has become as familiar as a cool night breeze through a window you leave open on purpose. Actually, I think the cold becomes a kind of companion after a while, a constant that reminds them the hull is intact. And the sea is doing its job holding them gently outside. They have been out here for many days, ghosting through the waters off the southern coast of Ireland. And they have learned to live with the cool air, as one learns to live with the quiet hum of a refrigerator in a dark kitchen. Schwieger lifts one hand and makes a small motion, and the sailor nearest to him repeats the order in a whisper that barely stirs the air. The periscope begins to rise, then a long, smooth column of metal sliding upward through the darkness of the conning tower. And the sound it makes is a soft hiss of oiled machinery that is almost hypnotic if you let it be. You can picture the tube pushing through the cold water above a silent intrusion into a world of gray swells and low-hanging clouds. And the entire submarine seems to hold its breath while it happens. The shaft moves inch by inch, and you might imagine the sea releasing its pressure in a gentle sigh as the lens nears the surface. As if the ocean itself were lifting a single eye to blink in the pale Atlantic light. And then, with a faint click that is felt more than heard, the periscope locks into place. And Schwieger leans forward and presses his eye to the rubber cup. Time stretches here in the way it always stretches in the moments before a decision is made. And for a long while, the only movement in the control room is the slow rise and fall of his back as he breathes. The world he sees above is a strip of water and sky, gray on gray, an endless blank page that tells him almost nothing, and yet tells him everything if he knows how to read it. I'm not quite sure what he is thinking in these quiet seconds, but perhaps it is something about the mathematics of the hunt, the cold equations that govern every patrol. There is no glory in this kind of war, not really. There is only the silent slide of the periscope, the careful calculation of range and speed and angle. and the question of how many torpedoes remain in the forward tubes. The men in the U-boat are not villains from a propaganda poster, not the sea wolves of the enemy's imagination, but rather it is easy to demonize the men in the U-boat. But perhaps it is more honest to see them as another cog in a machine that had already decided to grind up innocence. They eat tinned food and sleep in narrow bunks and write letters to their families that will probably never be posted until the war is over. And all the while, they carry the weight of a new and terrible kind of warfare on their shoulders. The periscope eye sees only what it needs to see a target or an empty sea. And the man behind it has learned to strip away everything else. The sentiment and the doubt and the distant thought of the lives that might be touched by his decision. It is simply mathematics, and the numbers must add up. One of the sailors, a young man with a thin face and oil-streaked sleeves, reaches out and adjusts a valve on the trim manifold. And the U-boat tilts just a fraction as it compensates for the slight change in buoyancy. You can hear the water shifting in the ballast tanks. A deep gurgle that sounds almost like the belly of some great sleeping beast that murmurs in its dreams. The engineers in the aft compartment are tending to the electric motors. And the hum of those motors is a constant thrumming presence that never stops, not even when the men try to sleep. It is the heartbeat of the boat, and they have grown so accustomed to it that they would feel lost without its steady company. The air is never truly fresh here, no matter how many times they run the ventilation when they surface at night to charge the batteries. It carries the residue of diesel exhaust from the last time the engines were running, of faint acridity that coats the back of the throat. And beneath that, the metallic taste of condensation dripped from every surface. I always thought that submarines must smell of salt and machinery and nothing else, but actually there is a sweetness to it too. A trace of the baking soda they use to scrub the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, a reminder of kitchens and homes far away. It is a strange mixture, and it gets into the wool of their uniforms and the fabric of their hammocks, and becomes the smell of their own skin after a while, a familiar lived-in scent. A drop of condensation forms on an exposed pipe near the overhead, a small perfect bead of moisture that gathers itself slowly from the damp air. It hangs there for a long moment, trembling with the vibration of the motors, and then it lets go and falls. And the sound it makes when it strikes the steel deck plate is a silver note in the dimness, a tiny plink. It is the smallest sound imaginable, and yet in the confined space it seems to spread a gentle punctuation mark in the long sentence of the patrol. You can follow that droplet as it splashes and then spreads into a faint, wet circle on the metal. And before long, another one begins to form in the same place, patient and inevitable. Time in a submarine is measured by these things: the dripping of water and the slow draining of the battery charge, and the soft creak of the pressure hull as the sea outside presses inward with its immense invisible weight. But the men have learned to trust the creaking because it is the sound of the hull doing its job. Like the settling of a wooden floor in an old house at night. And so they listen to the hum and they wait. You and I can wait with them for a little while, I think. There is something almost peaceful about it once you let go of the need to be anywhere else. Schwieger pulls back from the periscope for a moment and rubs his eye with the heel of his hand. And then he looks at the chronometer on the bulkhead. The hands have barely moved. It is the paradox of a war patrol that the hours stretch to eternity while the days vanish without trace. And a man can lose all sense of whether it is morning or afternoon above. The only clue is the quality of the light that filters down the periscope, a pale greenish glow when the sun is high, a deeper gray when the clouds thicken, and an absolute black when night has fallen. Right now the light is a dull pewter, the color of a November sky that has forgotten the meaning of blue. He gives another quiet order, this one even softer than the last, and the boat shifts its course by a few degrees. A slow turn that brings her bow around to face the western approaches. And then he presses his eye to the lens again, and the world above returns to him in a small round mirror. The sea is empty. The swell rolls in long, unhurried hills of water, and the periscope rises and falls with the motion. And the horizon is a bare line where the gray water meets the gray air. Nothing stirs. And yet he stays there watching, because this is the work of the patient watcher. And the watcher knows that patience becomes a quiet companion over the long hours. The boat is low on fuel, and that fact hums in the background of every decision like a second more insistent motor. They have been at sea for a long time, and the tanks that hold the diesel oil are running thin. And soon they will have to set a course for home and the long, safe passage through the North Sea. That passage will test them in ways that the waiting has not, and every man aboard knows it, though no one speaks of it aloud. They have only 2 torpedoes left in the forward compartment, and the after tubes are empty. And so, any target they take must be a target that matters. U-20, a Type U-19 submarine, was built in 1913 and carried 7 torpedoes. She had only 2 left when the great ship appeared. A detail that history would soon forget, but that the men in the boat would remember for the rest of their lives. I find it strange to think of that the way a simple inventory could decide the fate of so many souls. But then again, history is often nothing more than the sum of small forgotten numbers added up in the dark when no one was watching. The sailor with the thin face moves to the chart table and traces a line with a stub of pencil. And the line runs south of the old head of Kinsale and out into the open sea. The paper is damp at the edges, and the ink of previous notations has bled slightly into the fibers, so that the whole map looks like a palimpsest of routes and grid squares and tiny hopeful X's that mark where a target might be found. He does not look up, and he does not speak, and his whole concentration is bent on the simple task of keeping the dead reckoning plot accurate. Perhaps in another life, he would have been a school teacher or a clerk in a shipping office. And his careful script would have recorded cargo manifests instead of sinking reports. But here he is, in the belly of a steel fish, drawing lines that will vanish into the sea once the patrol is over. Let us stay with him for a moment and watch the way the pencil moves across the paper, slow and deliberate, as if the act of drawing the line is itself a small prayer that the line will lead them safely home. Above, on the surface, a bank of fog is beginning to roll in from the open ocean. A thick gray blanket that will soon swallow the horizon and reduce visibility to a few hundred meters. The periscope cannot see it yet, but the barometer has been dropping for the past hour. And the air pressure carries a warning that every sailor learns to read. Schwieger knows that the fog will change everything, that it will hide his boat if he surfaces to run the diesels and charge the batteries. But that it will also hide the approaching ships, and the mathematics of the hunt will tilt in favor of chance. He pulls out a handkerchief and wipes the lenses of the periscope, a small fastidious gesture that speaks of a need to see clearly. To keep the optics clean, even when there is nothing to look at. And then a drop of condensation, not from a pipe this time, but from the overhead itself, lands on the back of his neck and slides down inside his collar. And he does not flinch. He has, I suppose, grown used to the small, cool kisses of the sea. The way it finds every seam and every gap and makes itself at home in the wool and the metal and the skin. You might feel that same cool drop yourself if you sit here with me long enough. But don't worry, it is only water and it will dry. And the hum of the motors will keep you company while you wait. Time slows again, and the periscope rises and falls with the swell. And the man in the control room watches the gray circle of the sea as if it were a moving picture in a darkened cinema. The only sound beyond the hum is the distant muffled whisper of the sea against the hull. A sound that is almost like the wind through pine trees if you listen with your imagination rather than your ears. I have always thought that submarines are the loneliest machines, ever built. Not because they are isolated from the world above, but because they carry their own small world inside them. A world of pipes and dials and men who have learned to whisper, and that world is utterly self-contained and asks for nothing from the outside. It is a life of waiting, and the waiting becomes a kind of rhythm, and the rhythm becomes a solace after a while. A quiet place where the mind can stop racing and simply exist. You are safe here in the slow unfolding of the watch. The coolness is just coolness, not danger. The dark is just dark, not fear. And the metal around you is simply a shell, not a cage. And then, without warning, something changes. Schwieger's shoulders stiffen, a barely perceptible tensing of the muscles beneath the damp wool. And he adjusts the focus ring on the periscope with a single, precise finger. The sailor at the chart table looks up, and the engineer in the aft compartment pauses in his slow circuit of the motors. Though no order has been given. The whole boat seems to sense it at the same moment, the way a flock of birds will all turn together without a visible signal. There is something on the horizon. Schwieger does not speak right away. He breathes and he waits, and the periscope cuts through the gray swells like a thin silver finger pointing at the sky. And then he says the words so softly that only the nearest sailor can hear them. But they ripple through the steel hull like a current through water. A large steamer bearing east 4 funnels. The words hang in the damp air, and the men at their stations do not look at one another, but they know. They know what 4 funnels mean. They know the silhouette that is just now resolving in the periscope mirror. A massive dark shape that is still too far away for details, but already unmistakable in its proportions. It is a ship that could only be the Lusitania, the pride of the Cunard fleet, steaming out of the west and into the narrowing field of view. And somewhere far above in her wireless room, a Marconi operator would soon begin tapping out a message in Morse. A signal that would outlive the ship itself and quietly reshape the world's safety at sea. Schwieger's hand rests on the periscope handle, and the waiting is over. And the hum of the motors goes on steady and unremarkable, a gentle cradle beneath the waves, as if nothing has happened at all. And I want you to imagine for a moment that you are standing on a quiet headland somewhere very far from the sea. The air is cool and still. And there is a photograph in your hand, one that has been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases are soft as cloth. The photograph shows a ship, a great liner, with 4 funnels caught in a moment of absolute stillness on a gray afternoon. You look at it, and you know, in the way that we sometimes know things without being told that this moment was the last one of its kind. The ship is not moving in the photograph, of course, because photographs cannot hold motion. But the stillness in the image is something deeper than that. A quality of the light, perhaps, or the way the hull sits so heavily on the water. As if it had already begun to grow roots into the sea. I want you to hold that photograph in your mind. And I want you to let the day outside your window fade a little further into the distance. Because we are going to walk into that image together now very slowly. And we are going to see what happened just after the shutter clicked. The morning of the 7th of May had begun with fog, a thick and patient fog that wrapped the Lusitania in a cocoon of gray silence. Captain Turner had slowed the great ship to 15 knots, perhaps a little less. And the vibration of the engines beneath the decks had softened to something almost like a heartbeat at rest. It is strange to think of a vessel of such immense size moving so carefully through the water. 44,000 tons of steel and rivets creeping forward like a man feeling his way through a dark room with his hands outstretched. The passengers who were awake, the early risers and the restless sleepers, heard the foghorn sounding at regular intervals. It was a long and mournful note that rolled out across the invisible water and returned no answer. And there is a particular kind of quiet that descends on a ship when the fog closes in. A hush that seems to press against the portholes and muffle every ordinary sound. Footsteps on the deck are softer, voices are lower. And even the clink of china in the dining saloon seems somehow absorbed by the gray wool of the air. It is a waiting quiet, the kind that makes people look up from their books and their conversations and listen without quite knowing what they are listening for. You know, I have always thought that the fog that morning must have felt almost protective to some of the passengers. A soft white blanket drawn up around the ship to hide her from whatever might be waiting in the open water. The Admiralty had issued warnings, of course. The passengers knew that there were submarines in these waters, had seen the notices posted on the bulletin board, had read the small print of the telegram that had been delivered by a steward. But the fog seemed to make all of that unreal, a story told about a place somewhere else, a danger that belonged to a different kind of day. And so the passengers did what passengers do on the last full day of a voyage. They packed their trunks and they pressed their traveling clothes and they wrote final letters to the people who would meet them in Liverpool. They stood at the railings in the damp air and strained their eyes toward a coastline they could not yet see. The green hills of Ireland that were waiting somewhere beyond the curtain of mist. The old head of Kinsale was so close by then, just 11 miles, or perhaps a little more. a distance that the ship could have covered in half an hour at full speed. But the full speed was not possible in the fog. And so, the ship moved slowly. And the coastline remained hidden. And the passengers returned to their packing with a kind of patient resignation that travelers know very well. The steward brought tea, and the steward collected trunks, and the long day of arrival stretched itself out into the gray morning light. And no one knew that the photograph had already been taken. Captain Turner, that tall and quiet man with his white beard and his careful eyes, stood on the bridge and made the decisions that captains make. When the fog is thick and the coastline is near and the warnings of submarines are stacked on the chart table like so many unopened letters, he slowed the ship, as I have said, to a speed that allowed for safe navigation in reduced visibility. And because the fog had thrown off his ability to take proper celestial fixes, he chose to steer a straight and predictable course. A course that would bring him to a known landmark. A course that would tell him exactly where he was after hours of uncertainty. The Admiralty had advised, you see, that ships in submarine waters should steer a zigzag pattern. A deliberate wandering, a refusal to commit to any one direction for more than a few minutes at a time. But the zigzag required accurate navigation, and accurate navigation required a clear sky or a visible coast, and Turner had neither. And so the great ship steamed straight, a long and unwavering line drawn across the gray water. The decision that would later be debated in inquiry rooms and newspaper columns and the quiet studies of naval historians was simply, in that moment, the decision of a man trying to find his way out of the fog. Perhaps he thought he would begin the zigzag once the weather cleared. Perhaps he thought the fog itself was protection enough. We cannot know what he thought, not really. Because the thinking of another person is always a closed room. And we stand outside it and guess at the shape of the furniture through the frosted glass. And then very slowly, the fog began to lift. It is a remarkable thing to watch fog disperse. The way it thins and tears and shows glimpses of something brighter behind it. The way the world comes back piece by piece, like a shipwreck being raised from the bottom of a gray sea. The passengers who had been in their cabins came out onto the decks, drawn by the changing light. And they saw the green hills of Ireland rising out of the mist like a promise being kept. It must have been a beautiful sight, that coastline, after so many days of nothing but water and sky and the occasional distant plume of another steamer's smoke. The green was so green the way that Irish green always seems to be. A color that feels almost invented, a color that belongs in a storybook or a dream. And the passengers pointed and smiled and called out to one another. And the children who had been cooped up below decks for the long crossing ran along the promenade. With the particular abandon of small bodies that have been still for too long, the ship was going to arrive, and the voyage was going to end. And the trunks were packed, and the letters were written. And the fears about submarines seemed suddenly as distant and insubstantial as the fog that had dissolved into the warming air. A deck chair, still perfectly upright, slides slowly across the tilting deck, then crashes into a bulkhead. I want you to hold that image in your mind for a moment. The ordinary deck chair, with its wooden frame and its striped canvas. The way it moves with a kind of patient, inexorable purpose. The way it is no longer a place of rest, but simply an object responding to the new angle of the world. But this has not happened yet, not in the sequence of moments we are walking through together. It will happen very soon. But right now, the deck is still flat, and the chairs are still arranged in neat rows. And the passengers are still standing at the railings, watching Ireland grow larger on the horizon. And high above them, in the crow's nest that swayed at the top of the forward mast, a lookout was scanning the water. With the particular intensity of a man who has been watching gray waves for hours, and knows that the moment you stop paying attention is the moment something appears. His name was Leslie Morton, and he was 18 years old, or perhaps 19. A young man with good eyes and steady nerves, and the trained patience of a sailor who understands that looking is a form of labor. He had been in the crow's nest since early morning, wrapped in a coat against the damp. And he had seen the fog lift and the coastline emerge. And he had seen the green water brighten in the strengthening light. And then, at a little after 2 in the afternoon, he saw something else. It was a streak of white foam cutting across the calm green surface of the sea. An arrow of disturbed water moving with a speed and a purpose that was utterly unlike the lazy swell of the waves around it. A trail of bubbles that unfurled behind the thing like a silken scarf trailing from a dancer's outstretched hand. And Morton, frozen in the terrible geometry of the moment, took perhaps 2 full seconds to understand what he was seeing. Because the mind resists what it does not want to be true. The eyes report what the brain refuses to accept. Because a streak of foam on a calm sea on a spring afternoon does not look like the end of anything. It looks small and almost delicate, a white finger pointing toward the side of the ship, a line drawn by an invisible hand. And then Morton's understanding caught up with his vision. and he cupped his hands around his mouth. And he shouted down to the bridge with a voice that must have felt as though it was tearing itself free from his throat. The shout itself has been lost to history, of course. The exact words dissolved into the air and the sea and the years that have passed since. But the meaning of it was clear. It was carried on the wind and the sudden stillness that fell over the forward decks. Torpedo starboard side. Torpedo, torpedo, torpedo. The moment the torpedo leaves the tube is a moment that no one aboard the Lusitania saw. I want you to picture instead the cold green water of the Irish Sea and the bubble trail that is unfurling through it like a thought-taking shape. The torpedo is moving at something like 40 knots, which is faster than any ship of that era could ever hope to travel. But in the strange, slow time of disaster, it seems to drift. The bubbles rise and spread and linger on the surface, a white path that is at once urgent and languid, a contradiction made visible. The passengers who saw it, the few who happened to be looking in exactly the right direction at exactly the wrong moment, said later that it seemed impossible. That something so small could mean anything at all. A line of white on green, no thicker than a man's arm, pointed at the great black wall of the hull. And the ship, this immense floating city of 44,000 tons, could not turn. There was no time to turn. A ship like the Lusitania does not swerve like a horse, does not dance to one side like a fencer evading a thrust. A ship like the Lusitania commits to its course with the certainty of a continent. And its rudder moves it through an arc so wide and so slow that the change in direction belongs to a different scale of time altogether. The shout from the crow's nest was still hanging in the air. The passengers at the railings were still turning their heads in confusion. And the torpedo was already there. The sound of the first explosion was by many accounts surprisingly soft. A deep thud, a muffled boom, the kind of sound that a heavy door makes when it is closed in a distant room of a large house. It was not, the survivors would later tell the inquiry boards, the sound of a catastrophe. It was a sound that made people pause and look at each other with questioning expressions. The way you might pause if you heard something fall in another part of a building and you were trying to decide whether it was worth investigating. The ship shuddered a brief and violent tremor that ran through the steel frame and into the soles of the passengers' shoes. And then it seemed to settle as if the great vessel had absorbed the blow and decided to carry on. For a handful of seconds, perhaps, as many as 6 or 8, there was something almost like relief aboard the Lusitania. The ship was still moving, the engines were still turning, the decks were still flat. And then the second explosion came. In the end, it was not the torpedo that killed the Lusitania, but the second explosion, the one that should not have happened, that turned a hit into a catastrophe. I want you to sit with that thought for a moment, because it is one of those quiet truths that history keeps folded away in its pockets. The torpedo struck the starboard side near the bow, a solid and damaging hit. But not according to the ship's designers and naval architects, who testified afterward, a fatal one. The watertight doors had been closed, the bulkheads were sound, and the ship should have been able to limp toward shore. But then something else ignited deep within the hull. Perhaps it was the coal dust in the nearly empty bunkers, suspended in the air like a fine black pollen waiting for a spark. Perhaps it was the cargo, the artillery shells and the rifle cartridges that the Germans had insisted all along were hidden in the manifest. Perhaps it was something else entirely, a confluence of pressure and steam and heat that no inquiry ever fully explained. What we know, what the survivors described in their written statements and their quiet testimonies, is that the second explosion was different. It was a roar, a deep and resonant roar that came not from the side of the ship, but from somewhere far below. Somewhere in the very center of the vessel, as if the Lusitania's own heart had ruptured. The decks heaved a rolling lift and drop that threw people from their feet and sent the deck chairs sliding across the planking. The steam pipes burst, and the great funnels shuddered, and the horizon, that calm green shoreline of Ireland, tilted suddenly and terribly to one side. The ship was listing to starboard. A list so immediate and so severe that the lifeboats on the port side swung out over the deck and could not be lowered at all. The lifeboats on the starboard side were crowded with people who did not yet understand that a list of 15 degrees on a ship this size was already a death sentence. The water was coming in cold Atlantic water at around 11 degrees, pouring through the shattered hull and the twisted frames with a pressure that no pump could ever hope to counter. And the passengers, the same passengers who had been watching the green coastline and packing their trunks and writing their final letters, were suddenly living inside a geometry that had ceased to make sense. The floor was no longer a floor. The walls were no longer walls. And the stairs that led to the upper decks had become steep inclines that required both hands to climb. But we are not going to stay inside that moment, you and I. We are going to step back from it as if we were climbing a set of stairs ourselves. Stairs that lead up and out and away from the tilting decks and the cold water and the terrible noise. We are going to find a place where the air is still and the light is gentle. A place where the disaster is a story being told rather than a thing being lived. From that place, which might be the headland, with the photograph that I described at the beginning, we can see the shape of what happened without being swallowed by it. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes, a span of time that is at once impossibly short and cruelly long. 18 minutes to lower the boats that could be lowered, to find a life belt, to say a prayer, to jump into the sea. 18 minutes for the wireless operator, a man named Robert Leith, to tap out the distress signal. The dots and dashes went out into the ether and were heard by stations along the Irish coast and by other ships at sea. SOS, SOS, come at once, big list position, 10 miles south of Old Head of Kinsale. And then, with the water rising around his ankles and the tilt of the deck making the key harder and harder to press, came the final message. It was a simple string of coordinates, a repetition of the location, and then the signal went silent. The silence that followed must have been the loudest silence that any of the survivors had ever heard. It was a silence that contained within it the absence of the ship's engines and the absence of the ship's voice. And the sudden, overwhelming understanding that the solid thing that had carried them across an ocean no longer existed. The sea was covered with wreckage, with deck chairs and life belts, and suitcases, and the small, unnameable debris of 1,000 ordinary lives interrupted. And the rescue boats, the fishing vessels from Kinsale and the trawlers from Queenstown were already putting out to sea. Their engines chugging and their bows cutting through the gray swell. The rescue would take hours, and the counting of the dead would take days. And the telling of the story would take a century and more. And we are still telling it now in quiet rooms and whispered voices. As the light fades outside the window and the photograph in your hand grows too dim to see. Perhaps you are wondering, and I wonder it too, about the wireless messages that went out from that sinking ship. Not the distress calls, which were brief and desperate and entirely what you would expect, but the earlier messages, the ones that were sent in the ordinary course of the voyage. The Marconi operator tapping out routine traffic, the weather reports, and the passenger telegrams, and the ship's position. All of it flowing through the air in the invisible streams of radio waves that no one aboard could see or hear. These messages were received by shore stations and by other ships, written down in neat, careful handwriting in the logbooks of the era, and filed away in dusty cabinets where they waited for someone to come looking for them. And when the investigators finally did come looking after the sinking, and the inquiries, and the diplomatic protests, and the slow turning of the world toward war, they found a record that was at once banal and extraordinary. The Lusitania had been speaking right up until the end in the ordinary voice of a ship going about its ordinary business. and the messages revealed in their dry and technical language a failure that was not a failure of courage or seamanship, but a failure of imagination. No one had imagined that a civilian liner would be targeted without warning. No one had imagined that the wireless could be used to coordinate a rescue that would never come in time. And so, the wireless had been used for weather and for telegrams and for the small courtesies of maritime life. And the lesson that would emerge from the wreckage was this: the sea does not forgive a failure of imagination. And the ships that sail upon it must learn to see what they have never seen before. I will sit here a little longer, watching the light change outside your window. And if you want me to continue this story when the time is right, you know what to do. The photograph is still in your hand, the ship still caught in its moment of stillness. And the fog is lifting somewhere just beyond the edge of the frame. The photograph in your hand, it is still that same ship, the one caught in its moment of stillness. But you and I both know what waits just beyond the frame, just beyond the lifting fog. And I have been sitting here in the quiet, turning the old papers over in my mind. The way you turn the worn corner of a photograph between your fingers. The wireless logs from that afternoon are very matter of fact. You know, they record the ordinary things, the position, the weather, the telegrams. And then they record something else, something clipped and brief and terrible. At 2:10 in the afternoon, a distress signal was tapped out from the Lusitania, and the change that followed came far too fast for the wireless to matter. The torpedo struck the starboard side just below the bridge, and it was not a sound that anyone had expected. Not a distant boom, but a heavy, solid thud, as if the ship itself had been struck by a hammer from the depths. And then the sea rose up in a geyser of gray water and shattered wood, climbing higher than the funnels hanging for a moment against the pale sky. It was all captured in the reports afterward in the words of those who had been watching from the shore from the old head of Kinsale, where they saw the white spray and the dark smoke, and they knew in that instant that something irrevocable had happened. But you and I are not on the shore, not in the ship, only in this quiet room with the photograph and the dim light outside. And so we can let the image drift past like a cloud. The ship shuddered, and the shudder ran through the length of her, through the cabins and the dining saloons and the engine rooms far below. She was still moving, still cutting through the green water at 18 knots. And the momentum of that great mass carried her forward even as the sea rushed in. But within seconds, within the space of a few heartbeats, the second explosion came. And this is the part of the story that has never been entirely settled, the part that still drifts in the archives like smoke. The second explosion was not the torpedo. That much is certain. It was something deep inside the ship, a catastrophic blast that tore the bottom out, that sent a column of flame and debris high into the air. That turned a mortal wound into a killing blow. Some said it was munitions, the secret cargo of rifle cartridges and shrapnel shells bound for the war hidden in the forward hold. Others said it was coal dust, the fine black powder that had settled in the empty bunkers ignited by the shock into a searing fireball. The debate lingers in the dark to this day. And I am not here to settle it, only to wonder with you at how quickly certainty dissolves when the sea takes its due. And the sea did take its due with a speed that seemed impossible. You remember, I think the other ship, the one that sank 3 years before, the one that took 2.5 hours to slip beneath the stars. The Titanic had given her passengers time for goodbyes, and for the boats to be lowered. Time for the band to play, and for the cold to creep in slowly. The Lusitania gave them nothing. From the moment of the first explosion to the moment the sea closed over her, only 18 minutes passed. That is a number that can be held in the mind. But it is not a span that can be felt, not really, unless you have watched a clock hand move through it while the world collapses. And so the contrast is stark and silent, like two photographs laid side by side, one of a long, slow twilight, and one of a door slammed shut. In those 18 minutes, the ship began to list almost at once. And the list was not gentle, not the gradual leaning of a tired vessel settling into sleep. It was violent and immediate a lurch to starboard that threw everything sideways. The great Greyhound, the pride of Cunard, heeled over like a wounded animal. And the decks that had been level and wide became steep slopes of polished wood and running water. The lifeboats, those 22 wooden boats that were meant to carry everyone to safety, swung uselessly on their davits. Half of them tipped inward, trapped against the sloping deck, impossible to launch because the angle pinned them against the ship's side. The other half swung so far outboard that they could not be reached, dangling over the rushing sea like empty cradles. And in those moments, anyone who had come to the rail to see the Irish coast found themselves sliding, clutching at anything that would hold. But we will not linger on that, not on the details that hurt too much to hold. We will rise as if on wings and look down from far above. From that height, the ship is a dark shape on a gray-green sea, trailing a thread of smoke and steam that rises and drifts and vanishes. The water around her is churned white, and the lifeboats that have managed to be launched are tiny dark specks against the foam. Some of them already overturned, already capsized in the frantic rush. And now I want to slow the picture down, to hold it still in the way that you would hold a single frame of a film. That you cannot bear to watch at full speed. There is a lifeboat overturned, bobbing in the foam, its oars still lashed tight and its hull empty and useless. And that one image, seen from above, seems to hold the chaos within it without needing to show a single face. I do not know who might have been meant to sit in that boat, and I do not need to know. It is there in the photograph that does not exist, held in the light of a moment that never truly ended. And then the frame moves again, and the ship is lower now, much lower, and the bow is disappearing into the green foam. The stern is beginning to rise slowly at first, then faster, as the forward compartments fill and the weight of the engines drags her down. The water is full of wreckage, deck chairs, and cabin fittings, and the white plumes of steam that hiss from the broken pipes. The sound of rending metal is a low groan that travels through the water and the air. A sound that those on nearby ships would later describe as something living, something being torn apart. But we are not there to hear it, you and I. We are only here with the quiet hum of the room and the soft weight of the evening. And from this distance, the groan is just a memory of a memory, a story told by someone who read it in a logbook long ago. The wireless logbook. The distress call had gone out within moments, the standard signal, the dots and dashes that meant the unspeakable. But the ship was sinking so fast that the power flickered and died, and the last message was cut off. An unfinished sentence received by the shore station as a fragment, a broken plea. And the shore operators sitting in their headphones in the quiet rooms on the coast heard the signal fade into static, wrote down the time and the position. And then there was nothing more. The rescue that they scrambled to coordinate the ships that turned from their courses would arrive too late hours, too late. To find anything but the flotsam and the cold, cold water. And the word went out across the air, the wireless waves carrying the news to London and Liverpool and New York. But for those in the water, the word was already a ghost. Now the stern is rising higher, climbing toward the sky, and the propellers are bare and gleaming in the thin sunlight. The hull is a dark wall streaked with green and white, and the water is pouring off it in sheets, in waterfalls. As the ship lifts out of the sea, there is a pause, an eternal second, where the stern hangs vertical against the clouds, as if the ship were making one last effort to stay above the wave. The rudder, the propellers, the name painted on the counter, Lusitania, all of it framed against the empty air. And in that pause that held breath, the world is utterly still. The gulls that had been circling are silent. The waves seem to flatten. The smoke from the funnels which had been pouring out all this time is now a thin trickle, a last wisp that drifts upward and is gone. I have read accounts that describe this moment, and they all say the same thing. It was as if time itself had stopped. As if the sea and the sky had agreed to grant one final instant of stillness before the end. And then, with a sigh that was more a release than a sound, the ship slid under, and the sea closed over her, and she was gone. Gone so completely that for a moment the water looked the way it had before she ever existed. Just a smooth gray swell with a few patches of foam and a scattering of debris. And the people who were left in the water, the living and the dead, floated among the wreckage, and the cold gripped them. And the silence that followed was the deepest silence the ocean had ever held. The water temperature that day, the records tell us, was bitingly cold enough to numb a hand in seconds, cold enough to pull the heat from a body with an indifference the ocean has always possessed. But again, we will not go near. We will not let the chills seep into this room. We are wrapped in the heavy blanket, and the air here is warm and still. And the tragedy is a distant one, a story from another century that cannot reach us here. I want to tell you what a young steward wrote afterward, words that surfaced in a quiet inquest room long after the sea had settled. He wrote, "It was like a dream, a nightmare, and I could not move," and in those few words, I think, is the whole truth of it. A dream, a nightmare, something that was happening to him and also not happening. A separation of the mind from the body, that is the mind's only shelter when reality becomes too sharp to bear. And you and I, in our own quiet dreaming, can hear those words and let them settle. Let them become part of the story without ever having to live them. The Lusitania took exactly 18 minutes to sink, from 2:10 p.m. to 2:28 p.m. 198 people were left in the water. Those are the numbers, the bare bones of the event, the kind of thing you find in a ledger or a history book. But the numbers do not speak of the way the light fell on the water that afternoon, or the way the steam drifted and dissolved, or the way the silence after the sinking was deeper than any silence that had come before. They do not speak of the wireless messages that were now flying back and forth between the shore stations and the rescue ships. The terse, frantic exchanges that were a new kind of language, a language of position and heading and estimated time of arrival. That language would be studied in the years that followed by men and women who saw in those fragmentary signals the seed of a system that could one day hear any voice from any ship before the sea could claim its silence. And that quiet, invisible work, born of this very afternoon's chaos, would change the whole conversation of the oceans without fanfare, without monument. For now, the sea is calm again, and the photograph is still in your hand. And the fog that was lifting beyond the frame has lifted all the way. The ship and the faces are gone now. And the steam and the smoke and the white geyser of water have all faded into the gray Atlantic mist. And what remains is the image of the stern, that vertical pause, that one eternal second that is in its own way as still and quiet as the photograph I gave you at the start. And I find myself thinking in this hushed and heavy air that the mind holds on to such moments not out of cruelty, but because they are the only things that last. The panic, the noise, the bitter cold, those fade mercifully into the background of memory. But the image of a ship pausing against the sky or a lifeboat overturned and empty in the foam. These stay with us, softened by time, smoothed by the telling and retelling, until they become not memories of a tragedy, but icons of something gentler, something that speaks only of the quiet mystery of being here and then being gone. So I will not speak any more of the chaos now. I will let the room grow dimmer, and I will sit with you a while longer. As the photograph blurs and softens and becomes nothing more than a shape, a suggestion, a whisper of what was. And perhaps you will dream of green water and white foam. But it will be a dream from far away, a dream seen through a window. From a room where the blanket is heavy and the night is deep, and the only sound is the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath. The last sound of the fading signal has long since dissolved into the static, and the ship's final angle has become a memory. But the sea, you know the sea does not forget what it has taken. It holds its quiet for a time, and then it begins to return things, piece by piece. And what the Atlantic returned to the shores of Ireland in those gray, slow dawn hours was a harvest of silence. 1,198 souls were lost in the cold, churning water, and that is a number. A number so large it becomes an abstraction, a weight the mind cannot hold. But the mind I have found does not hold numbers. It holds the silence after a name is spoken. And so, on that first morning, in a little stone church near the harbor, a man began to read aloud from a list of names. The church was cold and the candles guttered in the draft from the open door. And the names rose one by one into the stillness, each followed by a pause that was longer than the name itself. You could hear the sea outside a quiet lapping against the quay, as if the water too was trying to listen. The man's voice was steady, a low murmur that carried the weight of wet wool and salt air. And he read a name like Martin or perhaps Mary, and the sound hung in the air and no one moved. Because in that small church The boundary between the living and the lost had become as thin as the candle smoke that drifted up toward the dark wooden beams. And after each name, he paused as if giving the sea a chance to correct him, to send that soul back walking through the door. But the sea never answered, and he read the next name and the next until the whole list was spoken into the cold gray morning. The light through the stained glass windows was soft and muted, the colors of the saints and the ships all blurred together by the drizzle outside. I imagine the people in those pews, their hands resting on their laps, their eyes fixed on the back of the person in front of them. They did not weep loudly, I think. They wept in the way people weep when the grief is too vast for noise. A trembling lip, a hand pressed to a mouth, a shuddering breath that was almost silent. And the man kept reading, and the church bells did not ring, because the bells would have been too heavy for that hour. The only music was the shuffling of boots on stone, the creak of the old wood, and the soft, relentless whisper of the tide. Soft concrete detail. In Queenstown, which is what Cobh was called, then a local woman gathered 300 flowers from her garden, marigolds and cabbages, and the last small roses of spring. She carried them down to the quay in a wicker basket, the petals wet with drizzle, and the stems still clinging to the soil of her own earth. And there, on the damp flagstones, she laid them gently on the bodies of 3 children whose small hands were still clasped together as if they had fallen asleep that way. The flowers were a riot of color against the gray wool and the gray stone and the gray sky, a tiny defiant garden that spoke not of sorrow, but of something softer, something that looked very much like love. And I like to think that in the days that followed, that small garden of 300 blooms became a landmark for the grieving. It was a place where people bent to touch a petal as if touching the children themselves. The bodies were brought in by the tide hour after hour in the cold and the damp. The temperature was something around 9 degrees, just enough to feel the chill seep into your bones if you stood still too long. The pier in Queenstown became a place of terrible, quiet industry. Fishing boats and naval cutters tied up with their sad cargo, and the townspeople came down with blankets and stretchers, their boots loud on the wet wood. Then the carts arrived, their wheels squeaking over the cobblestones, and the sound was a sound that I think you would never forget if you heard it once. It was a sound of ordinary life being pulled along, but now it carried the weight of the world. And the makeshift morgues were filling the Cunard offices, the town hall, the covered market, and everywhere there was the smell of salt and damp wool and the faint sweetish undertone that hangs in the air when death has passed through. I remember reading that the local people laid the dead in rows with as much dignity as they could find in the chaos. A carpenter worked through the night to build rough coffins. A woman brought a bolt of white linen and tore it into sheets to cover the faces. And through it all, the sea kept giving back its harvest, gently, relentlessly, as if the Atlantic itself felt a need to return everything it had taken. The sight, was a gray dawn over that small Irish pier, with the gulls circling, and the light so flat that every outline seemed sharp, and yet somehow dreamlike. The bodies lay in rows on the stretchers, and the seawater dripped from them, making little rivers between the cobblestones. And in the sand just beyond the pier, someone found a small shoe, a child's shoe, left alone by the retreating tide. It sat there for hours, a tiny leather thing with a buckle undone, and nobody touched it, because touching it would have made the whole thing too real. So it stayed a solitary witness, while the tide came in and went out again, and the world waited for the news to spread. And the news did spread, carried by the wireless and the telegraph wires that hummed across the ocean in the dark. But here on this side of the Atlantic, the first news came in a more immediate way. I want you to imagine a newspaper boy standing on a street corner in Cork, or maybe in Dublin, with the rain just beginning to soften the ink on the page. He was a boy of perhaps 12, with a cap pulled low, and the collar of his coat turned up against the damp. He held up a fresh extra edition, and the headline was in bold black type, the kind of type that blocks out all other thought. The word said simply, "Lusitania sunk. 128 Americans dead." And in the moment he held that paper aloft, the world seemed to hold its breath. The boy's voice cracked as he shouted a thin, high sound that cut through the drizzle. The paper flapped once in the wind, and I imagined a gentleman in a bowler hat stopped to fish in his pocket for a coin, his hand trembling just slightly. The ink was still damp, staining the boy's fingers black, and the smell of it, that sharp chemical smell of fresh newsprint, mingled with the smell of wet wool and horse droppings and the sea. And on the page, the letters were so large, so insistently black, that they seemed to throb in the gray air. The gentleman took his paper and stood under a shop awning. His eyes moved slowly across the words, and his face went pale, the kind of pale that comes from inside, from the sudden quiet falling of a whole world's assumptions. That headline, you see, was more than just a headline. It was a hinge. I always thought that history turns on moments like that, quiet, unremarkable street corners where someone reads a sentence and the old certainties crumble. The sinking did not pull the United States into the war immediately, not for another 2 years. But it planted a seed of fury that grew in the dark. It was watered by every new report of the lost, by every photograph of the small white coffins being carried through the streets of Queenstown. American public opinion, which had been a divided and hesitant thing, began to shift like a great slow river, changing its course. And you could feel it even then in the silence that followed the boys' shout. It was a silence that stretched across the Atlantic, settling into 1,000,000 parlors and kitchens. It was a silence that was not acceptance, but a gathering of breath. Gentle opinion. We look for a single turning point in history, but sometimes it is a succession of sorrows. The Lusitania was one sorrow that tipped the scale. And after that, tipping the old world's innocence, the belief that certain lines would not be crossed, that women and children and the neutral flags was still a kind of shield, was gone. Total war had arrived, and it was a cold gray thing that took no notice of any shield. But I do not want to dwell on that harshness now. I want to step back from the headlines and the maps and look instead at the small, forgotten things that history leaves behind. Because the big story is always there, loud and unyielding. But the quiet story is the one that stays with you a whisper in the dark long after the noise has faded. And so, if you will walk with me a little way from the pier and the church down a narrow lane where the mist clings to the hedgerows and the stones are slick with rain. Here, the sound of the sea is a soft, constant murmur, and the cries of the gulls are far away. The air is cold around 9 degrees, and the drizzle is a fine veil that settles on your hair and your coat, making the whole world feel tender and bruised. I want to show you something that I read about, once a tiny thing, almost invisible in the grand sweep of the disaster. In one of the makeshift morgues, a woman who had lost her own son spent the night walking from body to body. She straightened the clothing of the dead, brushing the sand from their faces and whispering a prayer over each one. She was an old woman in a gray coat, and her hands were worn and gentle. And I think about her now in the lamplight of this quiet room, and I wonder what prayers she whispered, and whether the dead heard her, and whether it mattered. I believe it mattered. It mattered in the way that all small kindnesses matter, the way that the 300 flowers mattered, the way that a child's shoe on the sand mattered. Not because they changed the outcome, but because they planted something in the human heart that outlasts the tragedy. Meanwhile, across the water, the political world was shifting on its axis. The German embassy in Washington had issued a warning. You remember, a small boxed notice in the newspapers advising travelers that a war zone existed. But the utter brutality of the sinking, the speed with which the great liner went down, the stories of lifeboats splintering and women clinging to debris scraped something raw in the American psyche. President Wilson received the news with a face of stone, they said. He walked alone in the White House gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, and the rain, if it was raining in Washington that night, fell softly on the just-turned leaves of spring. And in the smoking rooms and the country clubs and the train cars, the conversation shifted. The isolationists grew quiet. The hawks found their voices. And the seed that had been planted in the cold Irish morning began to put down roots. But it was not a sudden, dramatic turn. It was more like the slow, patient work of frost, heaving a stone from the earth, imperceptible until the stone has moved. The Lusitania, I sometimes think, was a photograph that America looked at for 2 years, a photograph that grew sharper with every diplomatic note and every new report of unrestricted submarine warfare. And when at last the United States entered the war in April of 1917, the memory of the Lusitania was there, a ghost at the table, a name on a recruiting poster, a child's shoe in a museum case. The world had changed, not in a single explosion, but in 1,000 small, quiet afternoons when people read the paper and felt something inside them harden. Now, let the noise of the world recede again. Let the newspaper boys and the politicians and the distant roar of the front fade into the background and come back with me to the Irish coast. The tide is going out, now leaving the sand wet and shining in the gray light. A local fisherman, I read, once found a rosary tangled in the seaweed, the beads worn smooth, the tiny silver cross bent but not broken. He put it in his pocket and carried it home, and when his wife asked what he had found, he could not speak. He just placed it on the kitchen table, and the two of them stood looking at it for a long time, while the kettle began to boil and the cat rubbed against their legs. That rosary, I imagine, became a little altar in their house, a thing touched once by a stranger, now kept safe behind glass or in a drawer with the best linen. And in that fisherman's silence, I see the whole of the aftermath, not the loud grief, but the quiet, ongoing grief that seeps into the cracks of everyday life and stays there, a faint salt residue that never quite washes away. You can see the whole scale of it from the hill above the town if you stand by the cathedral. Below you, the harbor spreads out gray and white and restless, and the ships come and go as they have always done. But for a long time after that spring, the town moved differently. The pub conversations were shorter. The children were quieter. And the women, I think, looked at the sea with something new in their eyes, something that was not quite fear, but a recognition that the sea, which had always been a friend and a provider, could turn treacherous in an instant. And yet, life went on. It always does, you know. The fishermen mended their nets. The shopkeepers swept their steps. And the little stone church continued to hold its services, and the names of the lost were spoken again and again until they became part of the fabric of the place, woven into the very air. I want to leave you now with one final image, a micro-image, small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. Imagine, if you will, that the child's shoe I spoke of earlier is still there on the sand long after the crowds have gone. The tide has washed it clean, and the leather is dark with seawater. A gull circles above it and then lands and pecks at the buckle and finds nothing of interest and flies away. And the shoe remains a tiny, patient thing as the sun, if there is a sun that day, breaks momentarily through the clouds and touches it with a pale, watery light. And in that light, the shoe seems almost to glow, a small, sacred relic of a world that ended and a world that began. Because the Lusitania, you see, was not just an ending. It was a beginning. It was the first crack in the old order, the first whisper of a new dark age, but also the first note of a song that would eventually become the modern world's commitment to safety, to communication, to the idea that no ship should ever again go silent without someone somewhere hearing its cry. But that is a story for another night, a story about the wireless and the men who listened. For now, let the shoe be your anchor. Let the cold Atlantic mist soften everything until there is only the sound of your own breathing and the memory of a list of names read aloud in a small gray church, and the quiet, unkillable love of a woman who brought flowers to sleeping children. And I will sit here a little longer with you as the room grows dim and the blanket grows heavy, and the night outside wraps itself around the window. The grief, you know, has faded with the years, smoothed by the tide of time, until it is just a faint, sad echo. And that echo, if you listen very carefully, sounds almost like a lullaby, now a gentle hush of water and wind and distant bells. And I think that is the truest thing I can tell you about history, that even the worst sorrows, given enough time, become part of the landscape, part of the quiet earth and the patient sea. And we who remember them become softer too, more tender, more willing to light a candle and whisper a name into the dark. So sleep now and dream of the gray coast and the silver rain, and know that nothing truly terrible can reach you here. The world is heavy, but you are light, and the night is vast and kind, and full of slow, healing silences. The sound arrives first, not as a noise, but as a presence, a low, resonant hum that seems to rise from the floor of the ocean itself. You might hear it as a whale song, distant and mournful, its notes bending and sliding through the water like strands of silk. Or perhaps it is only the deep drone of the sea, the ancient breath of the world filtering up through miles of cold, dark water to reach you now. It wraps around you like another blanket, soft and weightless. And you can feel it in your chest, a gentle vibration that asks nothing of you except that you rest. Above the surface, the waves lap against the hull of an imaginary boat. A rhythm so slow and steady that it begins to count the beats of your own heart, drawing them down, down into the calm. And somewhere far away, a lighthouse beam sweeps across the water. A blade of pale gold that cuts through the mist and then vanishes, leaving only the salt air and the night and the quiet. You are here now in the present on the grey coast of Ireland, where the wind carries the scent of clean salt and something faintly like wet wood. A reminder of ships and rain and the long passage of years. The sky above is a wash of deep blue and charcoal, and seagulls circle slowly, their cries soft and distant, as if they too are half asleep. This is the place where the RMS Lusitania came to rest all those